What we're going to be looking at as we move into Unit 2 is we are going to introduce some more complex concepts of what democracy is before we move into later lessons where we're going to talk about Great Britain. So the first thing that we need to look at is we need to reestablish what the idea of democracy is. Democracy is made up of the following characteristics, and really the main characteristic that we look at when we look at democracy is rights. In democratic societies, people have the right to freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and freedom of speech. While there are limits to these concepts, it is widely accepted that people are allowed to express their own views. So the big thing that we're going to see within democratic societies is that people within those societies have the right to express what they feel, and both their support for the government and their support against the government. All right. Democracy is made up of competitive elections. This concept is supported through the idea that people have the right to choose their government through regular, free, and fair elections between two or more candidates and/or political parties. So when we look at that, many countries use different types of electoral systems. We've got some that use single-member districts, which means that there's only one person that represents each district within the country. Some use proportional member districts, which a lot of times that means that you're going to have multiple people within a district. Within single-member districts, we're going to still see the first-past-the-post concept of the plurality idea, in which you don't need a majority of the votes to win. You just need to get the more votes than anybody else has gotten. And that's the same thing that we're going to see in the proportional system, is that, it really depends on the way that those votes are laid out between each party and candidate. Another important concept in democracy is that people follow the rule of law. Remember, rule of law is the idea that everyone within the society, regardless of what your social class is or what your position within the society is that you follow the law just as much as anybody else follows the law. Within this type of system, you have clear and fair rules rather than arbitrary rules that are exercised through personal power, and people can expect to be treated fairly by the government, both in how they deal with the state and in which times in which they've got to fight against it. Within that, we've got the idea of civil society and civic culture. Successful democracies have a civic culture in which people accept not just the rules of the political process, but the elites who lead them. So you see that within a lot of these places to where there is an acceptance of who the people are that are within the government. And even when there is protest against those people, it tends to be very mild, it tends to be very peaceful, and it's just a way for the citizenry to be able to provide input to the politicians for what they're doing. Having a civic culture and a civil society binds people in loyalty to the state. So the more civic society you have, the more civic culture that you have, the more civic capital you're going to be able to develop to be able to allow people between the citizenry and the state to be able to have a close tie to each other. When we look at democracies, most democracies run under the precept that there must be private ownership of the means of production within the state. This means that the economy is either going to run in a mixed market state or a free market state. Most industrialized democracies are the richest countries in the world, and the majority of their people are literate. Okay, so that means they can read, they can write, and they're making a decent amount of money, especially compared to the rest of the world. So let's look at the idea of democratic thought. We generally trace the beginning of democracy back to ancient Greece. But when we look at the concept of more modern democracies, we tend to only go back to the late 18th century, so that's the late 1700s. All right. The rise of democracy is spurred on by a number of factors: a growing concept of individualism, a push towards more capitalist societies, the development of Protestantism throughout different societies, the emergence of the scientific revolution, and the exploration of the New World. So all of these different things generally really push towards this idea of self-rule and democratic concepts, which once again are really pushed through the time period known as the Enlightenment, where there's an explosion of thought, and rather than this explosion of thought being used to serve religion and to serve society, it's generally used to question religion and question the societal constructs that already exist. Thinkers of this time period felt that the natural world was full of danger, and that by creating a society in which people could freely and fairly pursue their own interests would benefit all. So this idea that we are in the hunt, we are in society to mutually benefit each other, and that we need to allow people to pursue the things that make them happy in order to make society better. One of the individuals that really pushes this idea of individual freedoms and individual thought is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes claimed that if people were left to their own devices, though, that competition among them would be so intense that it would lead to war of all against all. So what he decided is in order to protect people against anarchy, people had no choice but to give up some of their freedom. Now, some of their freedom. Thomas Hobbes is not one to talk about how all freedom should be given up, but what he does talk about is this idea that in order to protect ourselves from ourselves, that we need to put some sort of leader in charge in order to make sure that we don't end up just killing ourselves. And this is Thomas Hobbes. Another preeminent thinker of the time is John Locke. John Locke shares many of the same ideas that Thomas Hobbes expressed in Leviathan. Locke believed that the state's role was to protect life, liberty, and property of its people. The theories of Hobbes and Locke were in line with early capitalists, and that is the laissez-faire concept, which is really French for let the system do as it does. Those who subscribed to the laissez-faire system of economics felt that the state should be limited and that it should only be a referee in the economic world, not an entity that prescribes action. So both Hobbes and Locke talk about how we voluntarily give up some of our freedom in order to be able to ensure the protection of our things and our life and our liberty, but that's only as far as the giving up of that freedom should go. And this is John Locke. Another universal concept that has to exist in order for a democracy to exist is the idea of suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote, and really in most democratic societies it was severely limited until the 20th century. And the way that it's limited is that most of the time you had to reach a certain age before you were ever given the right to vote. Most of the time that you had to be a property owner in order to be able to vote. So that really is going to severely limit the amount of people that have an opportunity to voice what they want to see happen within the government. It's not until the 20th century where we have the ability and we see the concept of women being kind of ushered into the ability to be able to vote, where we start to allow minorities to have a greater opportunity to vote within the system. So suffrage has become a lot more prevalent throughout society, but it's definitely something that when we look at the history of democracies, that there's a lot of change that they have to go through in order to get to where we're at today. So one of the things that we have to look at when we look at the idea of democracy is what we consider to be somebody who's on the left side of the political spectrum and somebody who's on the right part of the political spectrum. And that has changed throughout history. So when we look at the 18th and early 19th centuries, somebody who was on the left was considered to be pro-democratic, anti-clerical, and pro-market. Somebody on the right was considered to be anti-democratic, so somebody who subscribed more to communist or socialist ideals, somebody that was more pro-clerical, and somebody who was ambivalent on the market, and they didn't really know which way that should go. But as we move into the industrial era, we start to see a little bit of a shift. We still see the left as pro-democratic, anti-clerical, but for some, socialism and a welfare state is something that starts to creep into that perspective of what's supposed to be going on, because they tend to be more, people on the left tend to be more egalitarian in the things that they would like to see happen. Now on the right, we see more pro-democratic, we see usually clerical, and they're less positive about a welfare state, and they're definitely against socialism. And then as we move into the post-industrial era, which is what we're in now, we see the left, which is more egalitarian. They have qualms about a welfare state and socialism as we know what they're supposed to be, but they do look at things as being mostly global. They tend to see a real interconnection between different parts of the world, and they see new social issues and feel that those social issues should be tackled by the government. When we look at the right, though, they tend to be more pro-market capitalism. They tend to center their ideas more on traditional values, and they're definitely more nationalistic. So when we look at some of the things that play into how democracies take place, one of the big things that we see in industrialized democracies is the idea of the gender gap. The gender gap is the difference in voting habits between men and women. Many women have flocked to progressive parties, those that tend to see themselves on the left, while men have gravitated more towards conservative parties. And there are a variety of reasons why those things tend to happen. People who are generally in the conservative portion of politics don't want to see really any change in society. And there are a lot of things that they don't want to see changes in. They don't want to see changes in the workplace. They don't want to see changes in traditional family life. So there's lots of different things that go into trying to prevent some of the things that they see happening within society. where women tend to flock more to the progressive parties because more women are entering the workplace, because more women want to see their idea of what they want to have happen exercised within government. And in order for those types of things to take place, they have to be part of the progressive parties, which generally push for change within the society. In some societies, the hope is that we are moving towards more post-materialist concepts when we come to the idea of what we should be voting for. When you're in a post-materialist society, people who vote are looking for more than just the protection of their goods. They're looking for job security. They're looking for self-actualization, which means that they are looking to become the full version of who they think they themselves can be. And they're looking for more international understanding. So the idea of why things take place throughout the world and where our place is, and depending on how things take place throughout the world. When we look at some of the movements within democratic societies, there's some different things that happen. One idea is the realignment of political parties. So we're starting to see in a lot of democratic societies that different political parties are starting to take on different beliefs. In order for that to take place, the first step that has to take place is de-alignment. And this is when people begin to view themselves as more independent from the main political parties. So this is when you start to see a lot more people register themselves as independents within different political parties. And as that happens, political parties have to shift what they propose should happen in government in order to bring those people back into the parties. We also have an increased concept of interest groups. And interest groups are groups of people with a specific point of view that push to get people into office who support their point of view, and they will push legislation that will benefit that point of view.